The day Hester Keating arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, with nothing but a cracked leather satchel, a stubborn jaw, and the ashes of a burned-down life behind her, the sky over the plains turned the color of an old bruise, and every soul in town seemed to hold their breath. It was the spring of 1873, and the frontier was no place for a woman alone. The town of Dusty Creek sat like a stubborn pebble on the edge of the Texas Hill Country, 40 miles east of San Antonio, and a full world away from the genteel Virginia upbringing that Hester Keating had once known. She had come west on a stagecoach that smelled of leather and dried tobacco, sitting upright and proper while the man across from her snored through 3 counties. She had watched the land change from the green softness of the east to something harder, rawer, more honest. The plains didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. Hester had decided that she appreciated that. She had grown tired of pretending herself. She stepped off the stage onto Main Street and looked up at the sign nailed above the general store, Dusty Creek, population 412. Underneath it, someone had scratched in pen, and counting. She allowed herself a small smile at that. The town was a single main road flanked by wooden storefronts, their false fronts painted in peeling blues and greens and the faded red of old blood. There was a livery stable at one end, a church with a missing steeple at the other, and between them the full machinery of frontier commerce. A blacksmith shop, a dry goods store, a land office, a saloon called the Painted Mare whose piano music drifted out onto the street like something trying to escape. The smell was a blend of horse and sawdust and fresh bread from the bakery, and underneath all of it, the dry, clean scent of open country. Hester adjusted the collar of her dress, picked up her satchel, and walked to the land office. She had a deed. That was the beginning of the trouble and the beginning of everything else. The deed was for a homestead parcel of 160 acres, northwest of town, granted under the Homestead Act to her late father, Gerald Keating, who had died of fever in the winter of 1872 without ever seeing the land he had paid to claim. Hester was his only heir, and she had ridden 2,000 miles to claim what was hers. She had sold almost everything else, the furniture, the silver, the last 3 horses, to fund the journey and to buy herself enough supplies to begin building a life from nothing. The man behind the land office desk was named Percy Doyle. He was fat and pale and wore a vest that had clearly been intended for a smaller man. He looked at Hester over his spectacles with an expression that she had seen before on the faces of men who believed women to be a pleasant but fundamentally impractical species. "Miss Keating," he said, drawing the title out as though testing it for quality. "The Keating homestead. Yes, I have the paperwork here." He shuffled through a drawer and produced a folder. He opened it and then closed it again, slightly too quickly. "There is a complication," he said. Hester set her satchel on the chair beside her and folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me the complication, Mr. Doyle." "The property has been disputed. A man named Silas Holt has been running cattle on that land for the past year, claiming the original deed was improperly filed. He's a substantial cattle operator in this region, Miss Keating, a man of considerable influence." "The deed was not improperly filed," Hester said, her voice even. "My father filed it in April of 1871 in accordance with the Homestead Act. I have a copy of the filing here." She opened her satchel and produced a folded document that she had carried in a waxed paper envelope for the entirety of the journey. Percy Doyle looked at the document with the expression of a man who had just found a wasp in his morning biscuit. "Yes, well, Mr. Holt has, a certain way about things around here." "I do not doubt it," Hester said. "Nevertheless, the land is mine. I would like the process of formal transfer to begin immediately." She walked out of that office 20 minutes later, having accomplished exactly nothing except making Percy Doyle sweat through his undersized vest. But she had achieved the thing she needed most, which was information. She knew now the shape of the problem that stood between her and her land, and she was the kind of woman who could study a problem from all angles until she found the place where it was weak. What she had not anticipated was that the problem would find her first. She was standing outside the Painted Mare, trying to determine from the handbills on the wall where she might find lodging, when a shadow fell across her. It was a long shadow, belonging to a man who was clearly accustomed to casting them. He was tall, weathered as old boot leather, with dark eyes under the brim of a gray hat, and a jaw that might have been cut from the same limestone that made up the hill country. He wore a deputy's badge on his coat and trailed dust on everything else. "You'd be the Keating woman," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Hester turned to look at him fully. She made a habit of facing things directly. "I would be Miss Keating, yes, and you would be." Something flickered in those dark eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. Something in between that she couldn't name just yet. "Benjamin Reed. I'm the deputy here under Sheriff Cole Mason. You're going to want to talk to the sheriff, Miss Keating. Silas Holt was in this morning filing a formal protest against your claim." She studied him. He was perhaps 28, she guessed, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he had seen more of the world than Dusty Creek and its troubles. He stood straight but not stiffly, the way that men who had been through hard things and come out the other side sometimes carried themselves, as if they had learned that the earth was solid enough to stand on. He was looking back at her with the same frank assessment that she was giving him, and she found to her mild surprise that she did not mind. "Then I suppose I will talk to the sheriff," she said. "Thank you, Deputy Reed." "I'll walk you," he said. Holt's men have a habit of making strangers uncomfortable. She wanted to say she was capable of walking 50 feet without escort, but something in his tone told her he wasn't offering because he doubted her capability. He was offering because the situation genuinely called for it, and he knew it better than she did. She nodded and walked beside him down Main Street. The sheriff's office was a single room of rough timber with a pot-bellied stove, 2 cells in the back that were currently empty, and a man behind the desk who looked like he had been sheriff of this town since before the town existed. Cole Mason was perhaps 60, with a white mustache and the measured calm of a man who had seen most of the things the frontier could throw at a person. He listened to Hester's situation with his hands folded on the desk, and his eyes moving between her and the document she laid before him. "Your deed is legitimate," he said at last. "I've seen Holt's filing. His claim is thin, but thin doesn't mean harmless." He looked at her squarely. "Miss Keating, Silas Holt runs 300 head of cattle and employs a dozen men, and 2 of the 3 people on the county land commission have been eating his beef for years. I'm telling you honestly what you're up against." "I appreciate the honesty," Hester said. "What is the formal process?" "The commission will hold a hearing. Give it 30 days. In the meantime, I'd advise you not to go out to that property alone." "I need to live somewhere," Hester said. "I've spent the last of my traveling money on the stage fare." Benjamin Reed, who had been standing near the door with his arms crossed, said, "The widow Calloway rents rooms, $2 a month. She's a fair woman and she won't ask unnecessary questions." Hester looked at him. "Thank you, Deputy." He met her eyes, and there was a brief moment, barely a breath, in which something passed between them that neither of them was prepared to name. It was like the moment before a summer storm when the air changes quality and everything goes still and attentive. Then he looked away, and she looked away, and Sheriff Mason was explaining something about the commission schedule, and the moment dissolved like sugar in warm water. That evening, Hester Keating sat in the small, clean room that Ruth Calloway had given her on the 2nd floor of the boarding house, and she wrote a letter to her cousin in Virginia telling her that she had arrived safely, and that the land was hers, and she intended to keep it. Then she blew out the lamp and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of a frontier town settling into night, the piano from the Painted Mare, the distant low of cattle, the wind moving through the dry grass in waves she could hear but not see. She thought about the deputy's eyes and told herself firmly that she had no time for such things. She had land to claim and a life to build. The next morning she woke before dawn. The boarding house kitchen was already warm with the smell of coffee and cornbread when Hester came down. Ruth Calloway was a woman of 50 with gray streaks in her dark hair, and a manner that was brisk and generous at the same time, the way that strong women often are when they have been managing on their own for long enough to have stopped apologizing for their efficiency. She poured Hester a cup of coffee without being asked and set cornbread on the table. "You're the Keating girl going up against Wouldnt," Ruth said. It wasn't a question either. Evidently news traveled fast in Dusty Creek. "I am," Hester said. Ruth sat down across from her. "My husband tried to fight Wouldnt over a water rights question 6 years ago. He didn't win." Hester looked at her. "What happened?" "He died," Ruth said simply and without theater. "Not by Wouldt's hand directly, but the stress of it, the losing, the watching his dream come apart, it wore him down. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you so you go in with your eyes clear." "They're clear," Hester said. Ruth studied her for a long moment and then nodded once, the way women recognize something true in each other. "Good," she said. "Then eat your cornbread." Hester spent the first week in Dusty Creek doing what any sensible person does when they arrive somewhere new and need something. She made herself useful, and she listened. She helped Ruth with the boarding house laundry on Tuesdays, and in return, Ruth fed her and waived half her rent. She learned to identify which of the men in the general store were Woldt's and which were independent ranchers. She introduced herself to Elias Tanner, who ran the dry goods store and whose opinion seemed to carry weight on Main Street, and to Josephine Vega, who ran the bakery and seemed to know every piece of gossip in 3 counties, and to Reverend Marsh, who ran the church even without its steeple and who surprised her by being a quiet, thoughtful man who seemed genuinely interested in justice. She saw Deputy Benjamin Reed nearly every day. Dusty Creek was not a large town. He would tip his hat when he passed. She would nod. Sometimes they would exchange a few words about the hearing or the weather or the condition of the road out to the northern grazing land. She began to notice things about him in the way that you notice things about a landscape you keep returning to. The way he listened when people spoke to him, fully and without interruption. The way he handled the difficult situations on Main Street, the occasional drunk or the dispute over a horse, with a firmness that never needed to become cruelty. The way he sometimes stood at the edge of town in the early evening and looked out at the plains with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between longing and contentment, as though he were in conversation with the land itself. She told herself she was simply observing, the way a prudent person observes their environment. By the end of the second week, she had managed to ride out to the property with Sheriff Mason and Benjamin accompanying her, Wouldt's men watching from the ridge to the north, and making no trouble while the badge was visible. She stood on the land that belonged to her father and looked at the creek that ran along its western boundary and the flat shelf of ground above it, where you could build a house that would catch the morning light and be sheltered from the north wind by the limestone outcropping behind it. She felt her father's ghost in the dry air and the warm earth, and she made him a promise. "It's a fine piece of land," Benjamin said, standing beside her while Mason talked to one of the surveyors who had come to remark the boundary stakes. "Your father had a good eye for country." Hester was looking at the creek. "He never saw it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You said he died last winter." "November. He had been planning this for 3 years, saving, filing everything correctly. He was a careful man." She paused. "He wanted to give me something permanent. After my mother died, after the war took so much from us, he wanted to give me something that couldn't be taken." She felt the familiar ache settle in her chest. "I intend to honor that." Benjamin was watching her profile with an expression she didn't see because she was looking at the creek. But she felt it, the warmth of being truly seen by someone, the way you sometimes feel sunlight on your face before you turn toward it. "I'll do everything I can to help you keep it," he said. She turned and looked at him directly. The afternoon sun was behind him and it made a kind of halo of the dust in the air and the light on his hat brim. She thought, this man means what he says. Why? She asked because she was honest by nature and because the question was genuine. He seemed surprised by the directness. Then he seemed to appreciate it. "Because what Holt is doing is wrong," he said, "and because someone ought to do right." It was such a plain answer, so stripped of performance, that she felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time. She turned back to the creek. "Then I'm glad you're here, Deputy Reed." On the ride back to town, they talked about things other than the land dispute for the first time. He told her that he had come to Texas from Missouri 5 years ago, that he had worked cattle drives on the Kisham Trail for 2 seasons before taking the deputy's position, that he had a preference for open country over city life that he had possessed since he was a boy growing up on the edge of the Ozarks. She told him about Virginia, about the way the landscape was soft and green, enclosed in a way she had loved as a child, but that had begun to feel suffocating after the war had burned through it. She told him she had taught school for 2 years after her father's finances had recovered enough to allow her an education, that she had read every book she could get her hands on and had an ongoing private argument with herself about whether Washington Irving was overrated. He laughed at that, a real laugh, open and unguarded, and she thought that it was one of the finest sounds she had heard in quite some time. The commission hearing was set for the last Friday of the month, 23 days away. In those 23 days, Hester's situation developed in ways she had not fully anticipated. The first unexpected thing was Silas Holt himself. She had imagined him as a monster, the way you imagine people who stand between you and the thing you need most. But when she saw him for the first time at Elias Tanner's store, she saw instead a man of about 55 who was simply accustomed to having everything he wanted, and who had never developed the internal architecture that would allow him to conceive of a young woman from Virginia as an obstacle that would hold. He was not cruel in the obvious theatrical way of villains. He was dismissive, which is its own kind of cruelty, the kind that does not acknowledge that you exist enough to even direct malice at you. He walked past her in the store and glanced at her with no more particular interest than he might have given a new piece of fencing, assessed her quickly, and continued on his way. It made her angrier than if he had threatened her, because it told her exactly what she was dealing with. A man who did not take her seriously would not be prepared for how seriously she took herself. The second unexpected thing was that she found an ally she hadn't looked for. On the 15th day after her arrival, she was in the county records office, which was a small attached room behind the land office that Percy Doyle technically oversaw but practically avoided, going through the original survey maps of the region when she found something. It was a discrepancy in the maps that had been filed when Silas Holt had expanded his cattle operation in 1870, a boundary description that placed his northern fencing line in a slightly different position than the original survey of the public land. It was subtle, and it would require someone who knew the legal specifications of the Homestead Act filings to fully interpret, but Hester had spent 3 weeks reading everything she could find about land law in the Texas territory, and she was quite certain it meant something significant. She copied it carefully into her notebook and went to find Benjamin Reed. She found him at the livery stable, talking to a man she hadn't met yet, tall and broad-shouldered with dark skin and steady eyes, whom Benjamin introduced as Tobias Grant, who had worked cattle alongside Benjamin on the drives and now ran a small farm east of town. The two men had the easy, bone-deep regard for each other that comes from having weathered genuinely hard things together. Tobias Grant shook her hand with a directness she appreciated. "Miss Keating, I've heard about your claim. Holt's been pushing good people off good land for years." He said it straightforwardly, the statement of a man who had direct experience with what it meant to have the instruments of the system arranged against you, and who did not feel the need to dress that fact in careful language. "I believe I may have found something useful," Hester said, and showed them both what she had found in the records. Benjamin studied the copy she had made, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a lawyer, but he was a man who had spent enough time on the frontier to understand land descriptions and survey language at a practical level. He turned the paper over and looked at it again. "If this is what I think it is," he said, Then Holt's eastern fence line is sitting on public land he never properly filed for, which would mean his whole basis for disputing your claim, that your father's filing overlapped his established claim, is built on sand. That is precisely what I believe it means, Hester said. Tobias Grant made a short sound of satisfaction. You'll want to get this in front of someone who can speak to it formally before the commission. There's a man in San Antonio, an attorney named Marcus Webb. He's handled homestead cases before. Decent man, not in anyone's pocket that I know of. Benjamin was already looking at Hester with that expression she was coming to know, the one that told her he was thinking through the logistics of a thing the same moment that he was deciding to commit to it. I can ride to San Antonio, he said. I can ride to San Antonio, Hester said at the same moment. They looked at each other. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. 40 miles each way, he said. 2 days at minimum. I'm aware of the distance, Deputy Reed. I rode twice that to get here. There's the matter of Holt's men on the North Road, Tobias said, not unkindly. They've been watching the movements of anyone connected to your claim. Hester thought about this. She thought about Ruth Calloway's husband, worn down until he broke. She thought about her father and the land and the morning light on the creek. Then perhaps we both ride, she said. Benjamin looked at her for a moment with something unguarded and warm in his expression that he then carefully arranged into something more professional. I'll speak to the sheriff, he said. Sheriff Mason gave his permission with a look that suggested he had noticed a few things that Benjamin and Hester had not yet consciously noticed about themselves. The way that older people sometimes see the architecture of future feelings before the people involved have any idea that the ground is shifting. They left at dawn 2 days later. Hester on a bay mare she had borrowed from the livery, and Benjamin on his own gray gelding named Ghost, a horse of placid temperament and surprising speed. The morning was cool and clear, the sky a pale and boundless blue that felt like an invitation. They rode north first on the main road, and then cut west onto the cross-country track that Benjamin knew from his cattle drive days, moving through the hill country landscape of cedar and limestone and thin-soiled grassland that smelled green and mineral at once. For the first hour, they rode mostly in a companionable quiet that surprised Hester with how naturally it came. She was not a person who felt easy in silence with most people. She tended to fill space with words because quiet too often meant being overlooked. But with Benjamin, the quiet felt inhabited and present rather than empty. She had the sensation of being fully in the same place as another person, which she was not sure she had ever felt before. Then he said, without preamble, "Tell me about teaching school." She looked over at him. The morning light was on his face and he was watching the trail ahead. "What do you want to know?" "What did you teach?" "Reading and arithmetic primarily. Some basic history. I had 19 students between the ages of 6 and 14. She paused, and a smile found its way to her face that she hadn't been expecting. There was a boy named Thomas who could not be convinced that the alphabet had any relationship to reading. He had memorized the letters as a sort of song and refused to see them as useful objects. I spent 4 months finding a way to explain it that worked for how his mind worked. "Did you manage it?" "He was reading simple sentences by Christmas," she said. "You had to approach it sideways. Find what he already cared about. He loved horses, so we made a picture book about a horse using words he could decode. By the end of the year, he was reading horse manuals." Benjamin was smiling now properly. "That's a good teacher," he said. She looked at him and felt warmth move through her that she tried, with limited success, to attribute to the rising morning sun. "What about you?" she said. "What were you doing before the cattle drives? You're from Missouri." "My father had a farm," he said. "In the Ozarks, like I said. He was a fair man, decent with land and animals, less decent with the business of farming. We stayed poor in a quiet way that he never complained about. I left when I was 19 because the farm couldn't support 3 sons and I was the middle one and the most restless." He said this without self-pity or nostalgia, as a plain statement of fact. "I worked various things." helped build a section of rail line in Kansas for a season, did some hunting for a trading post, then the drives 2 seasons Abilene to the Rio Grande, then here. Do you plan to stay here? She asked, and immediately felt the question was too pointed, too interested in something beyond its surface meaning. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He took a beat before answering. "I've been thinking about that more lately," he said, and left it there. But there was a weight to the words that made her chest tighten pleasantly. They made camp the first night in a limestone hollow where a small spring kept the ground soft and a stand of cedar trees broke the wind. Benjamin built a fire with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, and they ate the food Ruth Calloway had packed for them, smoked sausage and bread, and hard cheese and dried apricots, and drank coffee from a tin pot that was battered to the point of character. The fire crackled, and the stars came out over the Texas hill country in a quantity and brilliance that still sometimes caught Hester off guard, accustomed as she was to the greener, hazier skies of Virginia. These stars were sharp and close and indifferent in a way that she found oddly comforting, the universe going about its enormous business while she went about hers. "You're not afraid," Benjamin said. She glanced at him across the fire. He was watching her with what she recognized now as his characteristic directness, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. "What makes you say that? Most people out here in your situation would be afraid. Alone, money nearly gone, fighting a man with more resources, but you don't seem afraid." She thought about how to answer honestly. "I am afraid," she said. "I'm afraid all the time if I'm truthful. I'm afraid of losing the land. I'm afraid of failing my father's memory. I'm afraid of being one of those women who end up going back east with nothing to show for their attempt." She looked at him steadily. "But I find that doing the next required thing is a fairly effective remedy for the paralysis that fear would otherwise cause." He held her gaze. "That's wisdom," he said quietly. "It's just what's available," she said. "I'm not particularly brave. I just can't seem to stop." He said very softly, "I think that is exactly what bravery is." The fire moved between them, and the night was enormous around them, and Hester felt the peculiar and frightening and wonderful sensation of a wall inside herself, developing an unplanned opening. They reached San Antonio the following afternoon. It was a city of several thousand people by 1873, a blend of old Spanish colonial structures and newer American ones, the military plaza still functioning as a market, the streets busy with the commerce of the region. Marcus Webb's office was on Commerce Street, a modest space that nonetheless radiated the careful precision of a man who took his work seriously. Webb was 40 and meticulous, with spectacles and a habit of holding documents at arm's length to examine them. He spent an hour with Hester's evidence and the deed copy and the map discrepancy she had found, asking questions at intervals that told her he was genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. At the end of the hour, he took off his spectacles and looked at her with frank assessment. "You have something here, Miss Keating. It isn't ironclad, but it is substantial. The discrepancy in Holt's 1870 boundary filing, if it can be corroborated by the original survey markers, directly undermines his argument that your father's claim overlapped his established territory. His territory was improperly expanded. Your father's claim was filed on properly public land." "Will you come to Dusty Creek for the hearing?" she asked. "The commission date is 3 weeks away." "Just under," she said. He considered. "My rate is $8 a day and expenses. I have a case in Bexar County that concludes next week. I can be in Dusty Creek the Wednesday before the hearing." Hester thought about the money she had left. $8 a day was not a sum she could easily manage, but losing the land was a sum she could not manage at all. "Agreed," she said. On the way out of Webb's office, Benjamin held the door for her, and as she passed him their eyes met, and the nearness of him, just the simple physical nearness, created a sensation in her that she was no longer willing to pretend was anything other than what it was. She turned to face him on the sidewalk with the noise of San Antonio moving around them and said, Thank you for coming with me." He looked at her with his direct, honest gaze, and something in it had shifted in the last 2 days into something softer, more open, and more frightened. "I wasn't going to let you do this alone," he said, and it came out with more feeling than either of them had quite intended, and they both knew it. She looked at him for a moment. The sounds of the city were very far away. "Benjamin," she said, using his given name for the first time, and the word felt different in her mouth than any word had in a long time, like something newly made and still warm. He said, "Hester," and her name in his voice was like that same new warm thing, and they stood looking at each other on a Commerce Street sidewalk in San Antonio, Texas, in the spring of 1873. Two people who had each been accustomed to standing alone in the world, finally registering the presence of someone who made that stance feel unnecessarily solitary. She was the one who stepped back first, though not from any lessening of feeling. She stepped back because she was a practical woman and she knew the hearing was 17 days away and that everything had to happen in the right order. "We should start back," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and there was a warmth in that simple word that accompanied her all the way back across the Texas hill country to Dusty Creek. The next 2 weeks were a kind of sustained forward momentum that Hester would later remember as the period in her life when she was most fully herself, entirely engaged with something that mattered and entirely present for each day as it arrived. She worked with Ruth Calloway in the mornings and studied her land documents in the afternoons. She walked out to the edge of town sometimes and looked northwest toward her property and planned what she would plant and how she would orient the house and where she would put the kitchen garden. She began to learn the rhythms of Dusty Creek, its small socialities and its fault lines, and she found that she genuinely liked many of the people in it. Josephine Vega brought her empanadas, and in exchange Hester helped her write a letter to her brother in Mexico that required more formal English than Josephine felt confident in. Elias Tanner extended her a line of credit for basic supplies against the successful outcome of the hearing, a gesture of faith that she felt in her chest like warmth. And then there was Benjamin. He came by the boarding house most evenings, ostensibly with updates about the sheriff's monitoring of Holt's movements, and those conversations would extend, as natural conversations between two interested people tend to do, well beyond their official purposes. Ruth Calloway would set an extra cup on the table without comment and go about her business with the carefully maintained neutrality of a woman who has reached the age of enjoying other people's happiness without needing to remark upon it. They talked about everything, about the changes coming to the West with the railroad pushing further in and what that would mean for the open range, about whether the government's treatment of the Comanche and Apache peoples was as unjust as it plainly appeared to be, and Hester was gratified to find that Benjamin's view on this was neither dismissive nor comfortable, that he saw the dispossession for what it was, and carried a troubled conscience about it even without a clear solution, which she thought was an honest position for an honest man who was also a deputy in the system that perpetuated it. They talked about books, and she was pleased to discover that he was a reader, irregular but genuine, who had carried a copy of Moby Dick across 2 states and read it by campfire light during the quiet nights of the trail. They disagreed about whether Ahab was tragic or simply foolish, a debate that lasted 3 evenings and produced no resolution but considerable enjoyment. On the Wednesday of the week before the hearing, Marcus Webb arrived on the afternoon stage and Hester was at the stop to meet him, and Benjamin was beside her, and she noticed that she had not thought anything particular about his presence there, until she registered the look on Marcus Webb's face as he stepped down from the stage and took in the two of them standing side by side and produced a small private smile that he immediately suppressed. She thought, "Am I so obvious?" She thought, "I do not particularly mind." The day before the hearing, 2 things happened. The first was that Silas Holt himself came to see her. He came to the boarding house in the afternoon, alone and unannounced, and Ruth came to find Hester in the garden with an expression that communicated both warning and readiness. Holt was a bigger man in person than he had seemed in Tanner's store. He had the weight of long authority in the way he stood, and he came into the parlor of the boarding house as though he had already decided the space belonged to him. "Miss Keating," he said, "I thought it was time we talked directly." "I've been available for a direct conversation since I arrived," she said, remaining standing. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had expected, she thought, tears or pleading or at minimum the kind of yielding deference that women in difficult situations sometimes performed for powerful men in hopes of softening them. He had not expected a woman who stood straight and looked at him the way she would look at any other obstacle in a field. "This land business," he said, "is going to cost you more trouble than it's worth. Now I'm prepared to be generous. I'll pay you $200 for the deed. That's fair money for a piece of land you've never improved." Hester looked at him. She kept her voice completely level. "My father paid for and filed that claim legally. The land is mine. The hearing tomorrow will establish that formally. I am not interested in $200, Mr. Holt." Something moved in his face, a tightening around the eyes. "I've been operating on that land for a year," he said, and his voice had dropped its cordial register. "I've improved it. I've run fence and dug a secondary well. Those improvements belong to me." "Your improvements were made on land you had no legal right to occupy," she said. "I'd suggest you speak to your own attorney about the implications of that before tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to make an enemy, Miss Keating." "I don't believe I'm the one making enemies, Mr. Holt," she said. After he left, Ruth came and found her sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded very precisely in her lap, and set a cup of coffee in front of her without a word. And Hester drank it and steadied herself and thought about the creek and the morning light and her father's careful hope. The second thing that happened was that Benjamin knocked on the boarding house door that evening, and when she came down she found him standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, which was not his usual manner, and she knew before he spoke that this was going to be a different kind of conversation than their previous evenings. "I heard Holt was here," he said. "He was," she said. "He made an offer and I declined it. I'm not worried about tomorrow." He nodded, but he was still holding his hat and looking at her with that unguarded expression that she had come to treasure. "Hester," he said and paused. She waited. The evening was warm and the first fireflies were beginning to appear over the grass at the edge of town, small drifting lights in the early dark. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it tonight before tomorrow because I don't want tomorrow to pass without you knowing it." The fireflies drifted. The piano in the painted mare played something slow and sweet. "I am not a man who talks easily about what's inside him," he said. "I was not raised in a family where feelings were a topic of discussion, and I spent enough years on my own that I got used to keeping things close. But I find that I can't keep this close anymore." He met her eyes. "You are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and I have thought about you every day since that first day on Main Street in a way that I have not thought about anyone else ever. And I don't know what you feel, and I know the timing is, well, it's complicated with everything that's happening, but I needed you to know." Hester looked at him for a long moment, at this man who was holding his hat in his hands on a boarding house porch in the Texas Hill country, and telling her the truth as cleanly and directly as he did everything else. And she felt something in her chest open wide and let light in the way a window does when you push it up on the first warm morning of spring. "Benjamin," she said, "I have been thinking about you in exactly the same way since that same first day, and I have been telling myself it was impractical and premature and that I had no time for it. And all of those things are entirely true, and none of them has made the slightest difference to the fact of it." He stared at her for a moment as though not quite believing the plainness of her answer. Then the most extraordinary thing happened to his face. All that careful composure, that measured self-containment, simply lifted, like weather passing, and what was underneath was open and warm and so genuine that she felt her own composure doing similar things. He reached out and took her hand carefully, as though she were something valuable, and held it between both of his. His hands were rough and warm, and she thought she had never been so aware of the simple reality of another person's hands in her life. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm going to win that hearing, and after that I would like very much to have a conversation with you about what comes next." His smile was so full that it changed his whole face. "I'll hold you to that," he said. He did not kiss her that evening. He held her hand on the porch while the fireflies drifted and the night gathered itself, and then he said good night and walked back down Main Street, and she watched him go and felt more completely certain of something than she had felt in years. The commission hearing was held in the town hall, which was the largest building in Dusty Creek, and which smelled permanently of sawdust and the particular compound of boot leather and paper that accumulates wherever decisions are made. Every chair was filled by 9 in the morning. Dusty Creek had been watching this dispute for weeks and had opinions about it, and the opinions, Hester had sensed, were leaning in her direction more than Silas Holt would have preferred. There is a thing that happens in a community when someone stands up correctly against a man who has been taking what he wants for too long, a collective holding of breath, a leaning forward. The 3 commissioners sat at a long table at the front. 2 of them, Hester had determined through her weeks of careful listening, were in Holt's orbit. The third, a thin older man named Gordon Pell, was independent-minded and had a reputation for being almost fanatically devoted to procedural correctness. Holt's attorney went first. He was a San Antonio man, expensive and smooth, and he laid out the argument with practiced precision. That Holt had been operating cattle on this land since 1870, that his improvements demonstrated established use, that the Keating filing contained an error in the section description that made it ambiguous. Then Marcus Webb stood up. He was a different kind of lawyer, quieter and more precise, the kind that builds its argument the way a mason builds a wall, one solid piece on the next. He walked the commission through the original survey dates. He walked them through Gerald Keating's filing and its compliance with the Homestead Act requirements in careful detail. And then he produced the map discrepancy that Hester had found in the records, and he walked them through what it meant. Holt's attorney objected twice. Gordon Pell overruled him both times with a precision that suggested he had already seen the same thing Hester had seen in the records. The deliberation took 45 minutes. When the commissioners returned, Gordon Pell read the findings. The Keating homestead claim was valid as filed. Holt's 1870 boundary expansion had included improperly claimed public land. Miss Keating's deed was to be formally transferred and registered within the week. The room erupted. Not in chaos, but in the particular sound of a community releasing a breath it had held for longer than the immediate dispute. Ruth Calloway, who was sitting in the second row, made a sound that was not quite a word. Tobias Grant, sitting near the back, nodded slowly with a satisfaction that had layers in it. Hester sat perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds, absorbing it. Then she stood and shook Marcus Webb's hand and thanked him, and turned to face the room, and found Benjamin Reed standing along the side wall where he had been for the entire hearing, and he was looking at her with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that she had to look away before she did something entirely undignified in the middle of the Dusty Creek Town Hall. Later, standing outside in the afternoon sun while people moved around them offering congratulations, she and Benjamin stood side by side and she said, quietly, "We should have that conversation." "Yes," he said, and there was a warmth in the simplest word she had ever heard. "We should." They walked to the edge of town, away from the congratulations and the noise, onto the track that led northwest toward her land. The afternoon was golden, and the air smelled of cedar and warm grass and the creek somewhere ahead of them, just below the horizon. He told her that he had been thinking, since well before the hearing, since the ride to San Antonio in fact, about what he wanted his life to look like. and that the picture that formed most clearly in his mind when he tried to imagine the future involved the hill country land, and the work of building something real and a particular woman standing in the morning light beside a creek. She told him that she had not come to Texas looking for anyone, that she had come with the explicit intention of being entirely self-sufficient and asking nothing of anyone, and that she had been somewhat annoyed to discover that asking for nothing and wanting nothing are not the same thing. He laughed, and she laughed, and the sound of it went out across the open land and dissolved into the enormous sky. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and there was nothing else in the world for a moment except the two of them and the late afternoon light. He kissed her gently, with the same careful honesty that characterized everything he did, and she kissed him back with the full conviction of a woman who had decided that practicality and desire do not have to be enemies, and when they finally drew back, they were both smiling in the way that people smile when they have just confirmed something they have known for a while was true. The weeks that followed were the best kind of busy. Holt's cattle were removed from the land by the end of the following week, a process that Benjamin supervised with Sheriff Mason, and Holt himself took the commission's decision with the cold silence of a man who has learned he is not entirely invincible, which Hester thought might do him some long-term good as a human being, though she was not holding her breath. The secondary well Holt's men had dug remained on her property, which Marcus Webb informed her was a legal benefit she was entitled to keep, and she accepted this piece of unintended generosity with straightforward satisfaction. The work of actually building the homestead began in early summer, and it was real work, the kind that occupied every muscle and every hour of light and left you too tired at night to think about anything except the next day's tasks. Tobias Grant came out with two of his farmhands and spent a week helping raise the frame of the house. Ruth Calloway contributed the kitchen stove that had been sitting in her barn since her husband's death. Elias Tanner extended credit for lumber and hardware and seemed to genuinely enjoy having done it when the house began to take shape. Benjamin was there every day that he wasn't needed in town. He worked alongside the other men without making any particular fuss about it, in the way that men who are comfortable in their strength don't need to display it. He was also there in the evenings when the work was done, and the crew had gone back to town, sitting on the half-finished porch in the long prairie twilight, talking with Hester about the plans for the homestead and about everything else. And those evenings were the ones she found herself most looking forward to when she woke in the mornings. She had moved into the new house in July, even before it was fully finished, because she found that she slept better on her own land under her own roof, even with gaps in the siding, than she had anywhere else. She woke in the mornings to the creek and the cedar smell and the birds, and the quality of light that she had seen that first afternoon when she had stood with Benjamin and Sheriff Mason, and known this was the place. One evening in late July, Benjamin came after his shift, and they sat on the porch drinking coffee as the sun went down over the hill country, painting the limestone orange and the sky 7 different shades of red and gold, and he set down his cup and turned to look at her with the expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was about to say something that mattered. "I've been talking to the sheriff," he said. "There are some things we've been discussing about the future of the department and some decisions I've been trying to make." She set down her own cup and gave him her full attention. "There's a position opening in San Antonio," he said, "with the marshal's office there. The sheriff thinks I'd be good for it. The pay is better, it's a bigger stage." She said nothing, waiting. "But there's also," he said and paused, and in the pause she could see him organizing something that was both clear and frightening to him. "There's also the matter of what I want, which I've been sorting out from what I think I should want, and they're not the same thing." "What do you want?" she asked quietly. He looked at her directly. "I want to stay in Dusty Creek. I want to stay on this land. I want to build something here with you, if you'll have me." He reached into his vest pocket and produced something small, which she only after a moment recognized as a ring, plain silver, simple and honest and clearly chosen by a man whose taste ran to the essential. I know we've known each other only a few months. I know that might be thought too soon. But I don't know how to be anything other than direct with you, Hester. And what I know directly is that I want to spend the rest of my life talking to you and working beside you and watching you build things. And I can't think of a reason to wait longer to say so. She looked at the ring, and then at him, and felt the full weight of the moment, which was considerable and wonderful and entirely real. "Benjamin Reed," she said, "I came to Texas alone with a cracked satchel and a deed to land I'd never seen, intending to need no one, and instead I found you, and I think that might be the best accidental thing that has ever happened to me." He let out a breath. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That is absolutely and completely a yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she looked at it in the fading light, silver and plain and permanent, and she thought that it suited both of them perfectly. They were married in October, when the hill country had gone gold and copper, and the mornings were cool enough for a fire. The wedding was in the church with the missing steeple, which someone had finally replaced the week before, as though the community had decided that the occasion warranted a complete church. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with the quiet, thoughtful warmth that characterized everything he did. Ruth Calloway sat in the front row and cried in a composed and dignified manner. Tobias Grant stood beside Benjamin as his witness. Josephine Vega had baked a wedding cake that was, by general agreement, an achievement that no one in Dusty Creek would forget for a long time. Elias Tanner gave a toast that evening at the supper Ruth organized at the boarding house that managed to be both genuinely funny and genuinely moving, a difficult combination that Hester filed away as evidence of a talent she had underestimated in him. When the evening ended and the last guests had made their cheerful way back to town along the moonlit road, Hester and Benjamin stood on the porch of the homestead, which was now complete, the siding finished, and the kitchen stove installed, and the small barn raised at the right distance behind the house, and the creek running in the dark beyond the cedar trees, and the stars enormous and bright in the Texas October sky. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in that good silence that was by now entirely familiar and entirely full. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about the question carefully, because she was a woman who believed in careful answers. She thought about Virginia and the long journey west and the cracked satchel and the land and the hearing and the house being built board by board out of necessity and hope. She thought about the evening on the boarding house porch and the fireflies and his hands holding hers. She thought about the ring on her finger and the sound of his laughter and the way he looked at the land with the same love she felt for it. "I am so completely happy," she said, "that it almost frightens me." He held her closer. "I know," he said. "Me too." The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that people who have lived through hard things sometimes describe later with a certain awe, the year when things simply worked, when the accumulated effort and hope and stubbornness paid out in a daily dividend of rightness. The homestead prospered in the modest and genuine way of properties, tended by people who know what they're doing and care about what they're making. They planted a kitchen garden in the spring that produced more than they could eat alone, and they gave the surplus to Ruth Calloway, who appreciated it practically and sentimentally both. They kept a small herd of cattle, nothing like Holt's operation, but enough to bring a steady income from the Abilene market, a process that Benjamin managed with the knowledge he'd accumulated on the drives. He kept the deputy's position through that first year, because Sheriff Mason was not quite ready to hand the department over to his newly hired replacement, and the county needed continuity. And Hester was the kind of woman who found that having the house to herself through the daylight hours suited her productive instincts perfectly. She established a kitchen garden and a small orchard of peach saplings along the south-facing slope above the creek. She began, slowly and without announcing it, to offer informal lessons to the children on the surrounding homesteads whose access to schooling was limited by distance. 3 children came the first month. By winter there were 7, and she was teaching them in the front room of the house on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, with a satisfaction that reminded her why she had loved teaching in Virginia, which was that a child learning to read is one of the most essentially hopeful things in the world. Benjamin came home in the evenings, and she would tell him about the children, and he would tell her about the town, and they would cook supper together and eat it at the table he had built in September from good cedar wood, and the evenings would stretch out long and easy and full of talk and warmth. In November of their first married year, she told him she was expecting. He sat very still for a moment when she told him, across the cedar table over the remains of supper, and she watched the information travel through him and rearrange itself into something large and real. Then he stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands and looked at her with such complete, unguarded joy that she felt tears come to her eyes without any particular warning. "A baby," he said softly, as though the word were new. "A baby," she confirmed, with the smile that had been waiting since that morning to be fully released. He sat beside her and held her hand, and they talked until the fire burned low about what this meant, and how they would manage and what they hoped for, and the conversation had the quality of something being built in real time out of two people's best intentions. Their son was born in the following August, large and healthy and vocal from the first moment, and they named him Gerald after Hester's father, who had wanted to give her something permanent and had, in the end, given her more than he had imagined. Benjamin held the baby the morning after the birth with the expression of a man encountering a truth he had understood abstractly for some time, but now understood completely. And Hester watched from the bed where she was resting and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a woman looking at a life that is exactly what she meant to build. Ruth Calloway came to meet Gerald in the first week, and sat with him for a long time in the rocking chair that Tobias Grant had made as a gift, and her face wore an expression that had nothing held back in it at all. In the years that followed, Dusty Creek changed as the frontier was changing, the railroad coming closer, the open range being fenced gradually into something more ordered if less wild. Silas Holt's operation contracted after a difficult season and then contracted again, and there was a general sense in the community that the long period of his particular kind of dominance was loosening its grip, which Hester witnessed without crowing over, because she was not that kind of woman, though she did allow herself a private moment of satisfaction on behalf of Ruth Calloway's husband and anyone else who had been ground down by the weight of it. Benjamin eventually left the deputy's position when Gerald was 2 years old, and a newly appointed full-time sheriff took over the department entirely. He turned his full attention to the homestead, and the combination of his range skills and Hester's organizational intelligence and their shared willingness to work produced a property that was small but thriving, the kind of place that looks, to people passing, as though it has always been exactly right. When Gerald was 4, they had a daughter, and they named her Clara, and she arrived in the spring with a look of determined interest in everything around her that made Hester think she recognized the expression and made Benjamin say, with great affection, "Lord help us both." Gerald took his role as older brother with a seriousness that was occasionally exhausting and entirely endearing. Clara, from the moment she could move independently, treated the world as her personal research project, and the homestead, the barn, the creek, the kitchen garden, the cedar grove, all of it was subjected to her thorough examination on a daily basis. The front room teaching continued and eventually formalized into something closer to a real school, with Hester teaching 5 days a week to 12 children from the surrounding farms and homesteads, and a board of the local families contributing to a small teacher's wage that let her maintain independence from the boarding house work she no longer needed. Reverend Marsh was instrumental in establishing this arrangement, with the kind of quiet, persistent doing right that characterized his best contributions to the community. The house grew a room at a time as the family needed it. Benjamin, adding each new space with the same careful craftsmanship he brought to everything he built. The kitchen garden became large enough to supply a small surplus that Hester sold to Josephine Vega's bakery and to the boarding house, and the peach orchard on the south-facing slope above the creek eventually produced its first real harvest 4 years after she had planted it. A morning of golden peaches in September baskets that she carried into the kitchen with a feeling of deep, layered completion. Benjamin found her standing at the kitchen table with her hands in a basket of peaches, and her face wearing an expression he had learned over the years to identify as the one she wore when she was fully, wordlessly happy, and he leaned in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment before she was aware of him. "They finally came," he said. She looked up at him. "4 years," she said. "I planted them 4 years ago, and now look." She picked up a peach and held it in her palm. It was perfect in the way of things that have been tended long enough. He came across the kitchen and stood beside her and looked at the basket. Then he looked at her with the expression that had been there since the boarding house porch and the fireflies and had never in all the years gone anywhere. "I remember when you planted them," he said. "You said you weren't sure the soil was right." "I wasn't," she said, "but I planted them anyway." He took the peach from her hand and looked at it and then at her. "That's what you do," he said. "You plant things in uncertain soil and they grow." She looked at him for a moment with the deep, accumulated warmth of years of mornings and evenings and children and cedar smoke and hard work and the creek running through all of it. "Not just me," she said. "We." He set the peach back in the basket and put his arm around her the way he had on their wedding night on the porch, and she leaned into him the way she had then, and the kitchen was warm and the peaches were ripe, and outside the children were somewhere in the direction of the creek making the particular noise that means they are entirely occupied and perfectly fine. "Hester," he said, into her hair. "Benjamin," she said. And they stood in that kitchen in the hill country of Texas in the years after the frontier, in the house he had helped build on the land she had fought for on the creek her father had never seen. And the life they had made together out of stubbornness and honesty and love was around them in every board and window and planted peach tree, solid and real and entirely theirs. And it was more than enough. It was in fact the specific, irreplaceable, perfectly designed shape of everything, and they both knew it. And the knowing was warm and permanent in the way of things that are truly built to last. In the evenings of the good years, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its night sounds, and the creek could be heard through the open windows in summer or imagined through the glass in winter, Benjamin and Hester would sit at the cedar table that he had built, and she would read or write letters, and he would work on some piece of harness or equipment, and they would talk, or not talk, and the room would be full of the accumulated weight of a shared life. The kind of fullness that comes only from time and faithfulness, and the daily choice to keep building. Gerald grew tall and thoughtful, and inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's way with books, a combination that made him a reader who was equally comfortable in a saddle, which Dusty Creek regarded as an admirable and practical trait. He was 10 when he decided he wanted to become a doctor, a decision that came after a period of sitting beside his mother, while she tended a neighboring family's sick child, and watching with focused attention the way she managed the situation. And Hester, who had always believed in children being taken seriously on the subject of their own futures, found him a copy of a basic medical text from Elias Tanner's bookshelf, and began his education in the direction he had chosen. Clara was 8 and fully confirmed in her project of examining everything, when she announced one morning at the breakfast table that she intended to be a teacher like her mother, which Hester received with quiet pride, and then added that she also intended to have a horse of her very own and a vegetable garden, and to learn to play the harmonica, which Benjamin received with the expression of a man who recognizes his daughter's essential nature in all its scope and wouldn't change a thing about it. The land continued, the creek ran, the peach orchard put out fruit each September. The classroom in the front room gave way eventually to the small schoolhouse that the community of surrounding farms built together in a cooperative effort over a spring weekend when Gerald was 6. A building that stood at the edge of the Keating Reed property, and which Hester taught in for 20 years, and which was eventually named the Keating School, by a decision of the board that she accepted with genuine embarrassment and genuine gratitude. Tobias Grant remained a steadfast presence in their lives over the years, an uncle in everything except name to Gerald and Clara, and his friendship with Benjamin was the kind that requires no maintenance because it was built of something that does not erode. On Sunday afternoons, when the weather permitted, he would come to the homestead and the two men would sit on the porch and talk about the state of the country and the condition of the land and the changes coming. And Hester would bring coffee and sometimes join the conversation and sometimes leave them to it, according to what the day required. They talked on those Sundays about the injustices that continued to move through the land like weather, the ongoing dispossession of the peoples who had lived in this territory before any of them, the way that the systems of law and land could be made to serve those with power unless someone pushed back with sufficient persistence. It was not a comfortable conversation, but they had it anyway, because they were people who believed that discomfort in the service of honesty was worthwhile, and because looking away from what was true in the world seemed to them both a kind of cowardice they couldn't stomach. Benjamin said once, on a late October afternoon when Gerald was 7 and sitting on the porch steps listening with large eyes, "The West we're building is only worth building if it's built honestly. Otherwise, we're just putting up another set of pretty walls over the same old rotten floor." Hester, who was beside him with her coffee, said, "Exactly right," and meant it completely. And Gerald, who was listening, filed it away in the part of himself that was being built by exactly these kinds of conversations and would carry them into the future. The year Gerald turned 12, Ruth Calloway's health began to decline in the gradual and inevitable way, and Hester went to town 3 days a week to help with the boarding house and to keep Ruth company through the increasingly difficult afternoons. Ruth had given Hester more than she had ever been asked to in those first weeks in Dusty Creek, and the repaying of that was something Hester did not experience as a burden, but as a privilege, which is the way such things feel when they are done from genuine love rather than obligation. Ruth died in the winter, quietly in her own bed in the boarding house with Hester holding her hand, and was buried in the church cemetery by Reverend Marsh, who spoke about her with the specific affection of a man who had known her long enough to speak from real knowledge. Hester cried on the ride home in a way she almost never did, openly and without control, and Benjamin drove the wagon and held her hand and did not say anything at all, because he was a man who knew the difference between the things that need words and the things that need presence, and Ruth Calloway deserved and received presence. The boarding house passed to Ruth's niece in San Antonio, a capable woman named Delia who came to town the following spring and kept it running. Dusty Creek's population had grown to over 600 by then, and the boarding house was a going concern. The town changed. Everything changes. The railroad came within 15 miles of Dusty Creek in 1881, close enough to change the economics of the area, without swallowing the town in the particular way that some frontier towns were swallowed by their own growth. Main Street gained a telegraph office and a new hotel and a second general store that competed with Elia's Tanners in a way that kept them both sharp. Percy Doyle retired from the land office and was replaced by a younger man who was both more competent and more ethical, which the community welcomed with the gratitude of people who have spent years working around a small but persistent inconvenience. Silas Holt sold most of his remaining operation in 1882 and retired to San Antonio, where he presumably spent his remaining years being comfortably important in a setting large enough that his previously unchallenged local authority was merely one note in a larger chord. Hester bore him no ill will at this late stage, and Benjamin said that was gracious of her, and she said it was more pragmatic than gracious, that carrying resentment for a man who had moved on was the same as building a fence to keep out cattle that no longer wanted your grass. He had laughed at that, in the way that she could still, after all the years, make him laugh with the particular combination of directness and dry wit that was her own, and the sound of it was as good as it had ever been. In the summer of 1884, when Benjamin was 39 and Hester was 36, Gerald was 11 and Clara was 7, and the homestead was at its most established and beautiful, there was a drought. It was the particular brutal kind of Texas drought that turns the hill country from gold to gray and cracks the creek beds and makes the cattle restless and the farmers worried, and the sky look like something has taken all the mercy out of it. The creek on the Keating Reed property slowed to a trickle by August, and Hester managed the kitchen garden with careful rationing, and the peach orchard lost most of its fruit that year. And there was a period of 2 months in which the daily management of the homestead required a sustained calmness in the face of genuine uncertainty that tested them both. But they had been tested before, in different ways, and the testing had not broken them. They managed the drought the way they managed everything, by doing the next required thing and doing it together, and by talking honestly in the evenings about how bad it was and what they could do and what they couldn't control, and by finding, in the midst of the difficulty, the things that were still good, which were always more numerous than they expected. The rains came in September. Not dramatically or all at once, but steadily over a week, the kind of rain that soaks in rather than running off, the kind that the land keeps. The creek came back. The grass came back. The kitchen garden recovered partly, enough for the coming months. The peach trees, which had looked dead in July, put out small tentative green shoots by October that said plainly, "I am still here." Hester stood in the orchard in October rain and looked at those green shoots and felt something move through her that was equal parts relief and recognition. She had planted those trees in uncertain soil and they had grown. They had survived a drought. They were still growing. Benjamin came to find her because he always knew where she was and stood beside her in the rain looking at the peach shoots. He was wearing his old coat and his hat and he was soaked through, and he did not particularly seem to mind. "They made it," he said. "They made it," she confirmed. He put his arm around her, wet coat and all, and she leaned into him. And the rain came down on the hill country and the creek ran, and the homestead stood on its 160 acres of good Texas land. And Gerald and Clara were inside doing homework by the lamp light, and the fire was laid ready to be lit when they came in. And none of it was remarkable except that all of it was exactly what they had both wanted and worked for, which made it the most remarkable thing possible. "Hester," he said, "I want you to know something." She looked up at him. The rain was on both their faces. "Tell me." "Every single morning," he said. "For as long as we've been here, I have woken up and felt glad. That doesn't happen to everyone. I know that. I don't take it for granted. I just want you to know that I know it and that it is because of you." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had become the whole shape of her daily life, who was in every board of this house and every furrow of this garden and every year of these children's growing, who had told her his truth on a boarding-house porch with fireflies around them and never stopped telling her his truth every day since. "It is because of us," she said. "Everything good here is because of us." He kissed her in the October rain in the peach orchard on their 160 acres, and the kiss was the kind that contains years, that is weighted with time and still somehow as present as the first one. And when they walked back to the house together, the fire was lit, and the children were at the table and the smell of supper was in the air, and the sound of the creek came through the open window, and all of it said, "This is real, this is built, this is yours." Gerald grew up and read his way through the medical text and found more texts in San Antonio, and eventually, at 17, was sponsored by the community of Dusty Creek in a letter signed by a dozen families to attend medical school in Austin. He went north on the stage at 17 with a cracked leather satchel that Hester had given him, the same one she had brought from Virginia, repaired and resoled and still serviceable, and she stood on Main Street watching the stage go and felt her father's hands in it somehow, the passing of the stubborn, hopeful thing along the line. Clara became a teacher, as promised. She also had her horse and her vegetable garden, and eventually learned the harmonica, working at it with the persistent curiosity that she brought to every project. She taught at the Keating School, alongside her mother for 2 years and then on her own, when Hester stepped back to a part-time role in her late 40s. And she was a naturally gifted teacher who had her mother's essential understanding that every child's mind is its own architecture, and you have to find the design before you can build in it. The years settled into the shape that good years settle into, their texture the texture of daily real things, the smell of coffee in the morning and cedar smoke at night, and the creek and the peach orchard, and the particular quality of the Texas hill country sky in late afternoon, when the light turns gold and horizontal, and makes the limestone glow like something is lit inside it. Hester and Benjamin grew into middle age together in the way that people grow when they have been growing in the same direction for a long time, not apart and not identical but compatible in the deep way, like two trees that have grown beside each other long enough that their root systems are acquainted. He still looked at her across the cedar table with the expression she had catalogued over the years, honest and warm and occasionally surprised, as though he still sometimes found it remarkable that she was here, that all of this was here, that the life had turned out to be what it was. She still felt the warmth that had come to her on the first morning when she had recognized that she was thinking about him, and it had not diminished with familiarity the way she might have expected. It had deepened instead, the way rivers deepen when they have been running long enough. He became known in the county in those later years not as the deputy that was long behind him, but as Benjamin Reed of the Keating homestead, which was known for good cattle management and better peaches and the teacher woman who ran the school, and he wore this identity with quiet satisfaction. He had found his place. He had built it with his own hands from the material the world provided. He had no complaints. Hester, who had arrived in Dusty Creek with a cracked satchel and a deed, and the stubborn refusal to be deterred, had become the shape of the community in a way she had not anticipated when she stepped off the stage that spring day in 1873. Not loudly or officially, but in the way that people become the shape of a place when they have taught its children and fed its sick and contributed their labor and love over enough years that they are part of what the community knows itself to be. The Keating School, the Keating Reed homestead, the peach orchard above the creek. These were things that people pointed to and said, "She built that, they built that, this is what this place is." On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, the family gathered at the homestead. Gerald came back from his practice in Austin with his wife, a steady, intelligent woman named Ellen whom Hester had liked from the first meeting and had come to love as a daughter. Clara was there with the particular brightness of a person who is exactly where they should be, doing exactly what they should do. Tobias Grant was there, older and a little slower but with the same steady eyes, because he had been part of every important thing, and this one was no different. Reverend Marsh's replacement, a young man named Davies who had been in the church for 3 years, and who had the same quiet devotion to doing right that Marsh had possessed, said a grace over the supper that was simple and genuine. They ate at a long table that had been moved to the yard for the occasion, in the September evening, with the peach orchard visible on the slope above them, and the creek audible below, and the hill country sky doing what it does on September evenings, which is to turn the kind of colors that make people set down their forks and look up. Benjamin stood when the meal was done and raised his glass. He was not a man given to speeches, and the shortness of what he said was part of its weight. 25 years ago, he said, a woman got off a stage in Dusty Creek with a cracked satchel and a deed and more determination than anything I had ever seen. She was going to build something out of nothing, and she was not going to be stopped. He looked at Hester across the table with 25 years in his face and all of it good. She built it. She built all of it. And I have been the luckiest man in the hill country to be part of it. Hester looked at him and felt the full weight of the years, and it was not heavy but warm, like good cloth, like something made to be worn. She didn't do it alone, she said. He smiled. No, he said. She didn't. Gerald raised his glass first, and then everyone raised theirs, and the toast went out over the homestead and the creek and the peach orchard and the limestone and the enormous Texas sky, and the evening was golden and complete, and there was no part of any of it that was unfinished. Later, when the guests had gone and the children and Ellen had gone inside and the yard was quiet, Benjamin and Hester sat on the porch in the old chairs they had brought out for the occasion, in the darkness that was full of stars and cricket sound and the distant voice of the creek. "Are you happy?" he asked, as he had asked on their wedding night. She considered it with the same care she had given it then. She thought about the cracked satchel, and the stage to Dusty Creek and the land office and the commission hearing, and the fireflies on the boarding house porch, and the San Antonio kiss on the sidewalk in Gerald's first morning, and Clara's first laugh and the drought, and the peaches coming back in 25 years of mornings at the cedar table with this man who was as familiar to her as her own breathing and as interesting as the first day. "I am," she said, "fully and completely." He reached over in the dark and took her hand, the way he had on the boarding house porch all those years ago, and held it. And the stars were very bright over the hill country, and the creek ran on its ancient course, and the peach orchard was silver in the dark on the slope above them. And the life they had made was around them in every direction, real and solid and entirely built. Every board and planted tree and teaching moment and shared morning, built out of two people's best and most honest selves, which is the only material worth building anything from. She held his hand and listened to the creek, and felt the full, simple, permanent truth of where she was and who she was with, and was glad, in the deep and final way of things that are genuinely and completely right, that she had gotten off that stage in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1873, with her cracked satchel and her deed and her determination, and had not been stopped.